my channel. What am I going to be doing today? It's going to be a video that I'm going to read you the research of the article of why coronavirus is killing African Americans more than others. So basically, before I read this article, I did some research and did a list of questions and it took the abundant time to find out the answers. But in knowing this, I gotta be sure this info is credible. You gotta be sure the info is real and what is not real. I know this is a sad fact, but then I guess this has something to do with Black Lives Matter, or how much African Americans have suffered throughout the centuries. And so I'm going to read you some questions, and I'm going to read you some articles. Yeah, sorry it took so long to make the video, and sorry for the noise of the background. I was outside helping out my family. So this article, where we asked right now, is why is African Americans being killed more than others? Well, here's why. Well, here is the reason right here. Is here. Okay, here it is. So, why black people? So here are the questions that I'm going to read you, and before I get to the article. Who is the author? Jamal Bowie. He's the one who wrote that article. What resources did you find? New York Times. What date did it publish? April 14th, 2020. Why are blacks more infected than whites? Blacks' susceptibility to infection has everything to do with racial character of inequality in U.S. What is the ending? As the pattern remains, there is no better society. Name of the title. Of course, it says why coronavirus is killing African Americans more than others. What is this? And accessibility means a state or fact of being likely or liable to be influenced or harmed by a particular thing. And the author's purpose is to expose the reason why African Americans were denied by capitalism that is tied to the history of segregation and racial inequality. So, like the question said, it's that article has something to do with there are two main reasons. As I read these questions, is that African Americans are more susceptibility than others. That has something to do with racial character of inequality in the United States. And the main purpose of this article is to expose the reason that African Americans are denied by capitalism that is tied to segregation and racial inequality in history. And that is a sad fact that we had to be aware of how much black people suffer. So this video is the purpose to serve the history of African American suffrage. Now let's get on with the article. Why is coronavirus killing African Americans more than others? Written by Jamal Bowie. We know that the coronavirus We know that COVID-19 is killing African Americans at greater rates than any other group. You can see this most clearly in the South. In Louisiana, blacks account for 70% of the deaths of 33% of the population. In Alabama, they account for 44% of deaths and 26% of the population. South Carolina and Georgia have yet to release information to death disparities in both states. Blacks are blacks are more likely to be infected than whites. The pattern exists in the North as well, where African Americans' population in cities like Chicago and Milwaukee have high infection death rates. Federal officials have tied these disparities to individual behavior. The Surgeon General of the United States, Jerome Adams, who is African American, urged blacks and other communities of color to avoid alcohol, tobacco, and drugs, as if this was a particular problem for those groups. In truth, black susceptibility to infection and death in the coronavirus pandemic has everything to do with racial character of inequality in the United States. This is the main reason. To give a few relevant examples, black Africans are more likely to work in service sectors, their jobs, least likely to own a car, and least likely to own their homes. They are therefore more likely to be in close contact with other people. From the ways they travel to the kinds of work they do not conditions in which they live. Today's disparity of low flow directly from yesterday's disparities of wealth and opportunity. The African Americans are overrepresented in service sector jobs, reflects a history of racially segmented labor markets that kept them at the bottom of the economic ladder. That they are less likely to own their homes reflects a history of stark housing discrimination, government sanction, and government sponsored. If black Americans are more likely to suffer the commodities that make coronavirus more deadly, it's because those ailments are tied to the segregation and concentrated property that still mark their communities. What's important to understand that it is racialized inequality isn't a mistake. It isn't a flaw in this system. It reflects something in the character of American capitalism itself, the deep logic that produced the same outcomes again and again. American capitalism did not emerge ex nihilo into the world. Nihilo. It grew out of existing social, political, economic arrangements, toppling some and incorporating others as it took shape in the second half of the 19th century. White supremacy was one of those arrangements. The Civil War may have destroyed slave society, but the racial hierarchy that was central to that society survived the carnage and disruption of the conflict to shape the aftermath, especially in the absence of the sustained program to racially restructure the social and economic life of the South. For the most part, before the war, blackness marked one as a slave. Afterward, it marked as one of the lowest of labors, regulated to sharecropper and domestic work, excluded from the mounting ranks of industrial labor. With the coming of industry and the factory system, that the social code which made manual labor a degrading factor was no longer a biting force. The historian Charles H. Wesley wrote in this book in 1927, Negro labor in the United States, 1850 and 1925. Work in the factories was honorable, and it was to be considered the particular task of white workers, which is to say, as a developing United States, industrial capitalism retained a caste system with whites as a dominant social group. This wasn't just a matter of prejudice. It is as under slavery, raised under industrial capitalism structure one's relationship to both production and personhood. Whiteness. The philosopher Charles W. Mills wrote under note, the division of the labor and the allocation of resources with corresponding enhanced socioeconomic life chances for one's white self and one's white children. It's not that life was particularly good for the white workers, but the blacks faced additional challenges from the denial of formal political rights to social exclusion and widespread state-sanctioned violence. If they lived in cities, blacks were regulated to the least sanctuary neighborhoods with the most substandard housing. If they had a skill or knew a craft, they were excluded from the guides and unions that would have given them a path to employment. If they possessed a formal education, they were barred from most middle-class profession. The overoppression of blacks in institutions like the post-6 service is a direct legacy of this exclusion. Postal workers has historically one of the few stable jobs available to blacks. For years, the post office had commonly been considered a safe job for blacks because of exclusion by both white capital and white labor in the private sector. Historian Philip F. Rubio explained, in There's Always Work at the Post Office, African Americans, postal workers, and the fight for jobs, justice, and equality. By the time we reach the new era, the racial differentiate of capitalist inequality divided in labor markets. Why racial disparities in employment income and education was part of the pattern of American life even in the midst of the Depression. And as policymakers in Washington worked to address the crisis, they built that their foundation and deepened those disparities, sometimes by accident, but often because of direct pressure from the white South and its lawmakers by design. By not including occupation with African American workers, and by organizing racist patterns of administration, New Deal policies for social society, social welfare, and labor market programs restricted black prospects while providing positive economic reinforcement for the great majority of white citizens. The historian Ira Katzenell writes in when affirmative action was white, an untold history of racial inequality in 20th century America. Building on its 16th discrimination, federal policymakers further segregated northern cities and created new geographies of disadvantage that separated black Americans from jobs and opportunities in the post-war boom. At the same time, policies like state subsidized education, for the stump of reading, low-interest home loans, and an interstate highway system helped turn a working class of ethnic Europeans into the middle class of whites. That is not fair. That wasn't even fair back then. Of course, my quick account of the history of racial inequality in American flatters a great deal in nuance. The mass of white workers may have been attached to that W.E.B. Du Bois called a psychological wage of racial entitlement, but it is also true that racially divided labor suited owners of work capital who took advantage of racism when it suited their interests. Despite this, the last decade of the 19th century and the first decades of 20th saw moments of interracial labor, militancy, and aggregation, rebellion, glimpses of a different, more equal pathway for American life. Aspects of the New Deal may have entrenched racial inequality, but African Americans still made real economic and social gains under Franklin Roosevelt. That's why on the eve of the 1940 Democratic Presidential Convention, one black newspaper concluded that Negroes have been given fairer and more impartial treatment by government agencies in recent years than ever before in the history of the Republic. Last page. There's more. By mid-century, the institutions of the labor movement that made the taking of the fight against Jim Crow racism and the wake of the civil rights movement, a black middle class did begin to take shape. But if you look at the full picture of American society, it's clear that the structural position of black Americans isn't so different from what it was at the advent of the industrial age. Race still shapes personhood. It still marks the boundaries of who belongs and who doesn't, of which groups face the brunt of capitalist inequality in all its forms, and which gets some respite. Race, in other words, still answers the questions of who will live in the crowded, segregated neighborhoods, who will be exposed to lead poison pipes and toxic waste, who will live with polluted air and suffer disproportionately from maladies like asthma and heart disease. And when disease comes, who will be the first to succumb in large numbers? If there was anything you could predict about this pandemic, anything you could be certain about once it reached America's shores, it was that some communities that weather the storm while others would sink under the waves. And in the distribution of this suffering would have everything to do with pattern, including by the past. As long as those patterns remains, there is no path to a better society. We need to break them before they break us. So that will be the end of the video. And so, in the description, this article I found in New York Times will be the link will be found under the link under the video. And if you like this video, hit the like and hit the subscribe. If you have any questions or any comments you have to say, just write them down in the videos and comments, plain and simple. So, I hope you have a good sleep, and hope you can think on it and do some more about research. And if you have any questions about research, or if you have any requests of more research readings, please let me know, and I'll post tons of videos you wish. So I hope you have a good day, players, and have a good night.